From the moment my son's wife walked through the doors of our home, I sensed something shifting in the air. It wasn't the kind of shift that comes with excitement or new beginnings. No, it was something heavier, almost like a warning that my life, the one I had built around love and sacrifice, was about to unravel. I should have been happy that day. My son, the very center of my world, had finally found someone he wanted to spend his life with. I had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining laughter filling the house again, imagining a daughter-in-law who might see me not as an obstacle, but as another mother. Instead, all I felt was the sting of invisible walls going up around me, walls that kept me out of a home that once felt safe and warm. Perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that moment cut so deeply, you need to know what my life looked like before she arrived. I was just 38 when I lost my husband. One day he was there, strong and full of plans for our future, and the next I found myself staring into an emptiness I never thought I could survive. People told me grief would ease over time, but for me the weight of it lingered like a shadow. Still, I had no choice but to keep moving because my son, only 12 then, needed me. I poured everything I had into raising him, every hour at work, every sleepless night, every dream I set aside was for him. I told myself that if I could raise him into a kind, successful man, all the sacrifices would be worth it. And in many ways they were. He grew into someone I was deeply proud of, ambitious, polite, full of promise. He became the anchor that kept me going. The house we lived in carried echoes of laughter from his childhood, birthday balloons tied to kitchen chairs, school projects spread across the dining table, the sound of his sneakers running down the hallway. I lived for those moments. For him. When you've lost everything else, the love of your child is enough to keep you breathing. So when he told me he'd met someone special, my heart soared. I thought, finally. After all these years, we'll welcome someone new into our family. Maybe she'll be the daughter I never had. I didn't just want to like her. I wanted to love her. I wanted her to feel at home with me. The wedding day was bright and full of promise. I watched them exchange vows with tears in my eyes, believing this was the start of something beautiful. But what I didn't know then was that from the very first day she entered my life, she made it clear there was no place for me beside them. At first I tried to brush aside the uneasy feeling. Change is never easy, I told myself. Perhaps she was nervous, adjusting to a new life, or maybe I was just too sensitive. I wanted so desperately for things to work, so I convinced myself to ignore the subtle remarks that seemed to cut deeper than they should. The first sign came not long after they returned from their honeymoon. I had prepared a welcome dinner, spending the entire day in the kitchen, cooking the very dishes my son had grown up loving. When I placed the food on the table, she smiled politely, but then I heard her whisper to him, "We don't really need all this heavy food anymore. We should eat differently now." Her words weren't loud, but loud enough for me to hear. I tried to laugh it off. "You know, I can always learn new recipes," I said lightly, hoping she might see my willingness to adapt. But she didn't respond. Instead, she changed the subject, directing all her attention back to him. There were other small moments too. Moments that, on the surface, seemed harmless, but carried an edge that I couldn't ignore. She would comment on how old-fashioned the house looked, the very home where I had spent decades creating memories. She would question why I still worked so hard, saying things like, "Shouldn't you be slowing down by now?" As if the years I'd spent providing were something to be dismissed. My son, perhaps trying to keep the peace, never challenged her. He'd nod along quietly, sometimes offering me a weak smile as though to say, "Please, just let it go." I wanted to believe he still valued my place, that he understood everything I had given up for him. But every time he remained silent, a part of me feared I was losing him. Despite the unease, I tried to welcome her with an open heart. I offered help when they moved their things into the house, arranging space for her belongings, even giving up some of the rooms I had once used for storage. I told her stories of my son's childhood, hoping she might laugh with me, bond with me over the boy who had become her husband. But she rarely smiled. Instead, her eyes often carried the same message. You don't belong here anymore. Still, I kept telling myself to be patient. After all, it was just the beginning. Maybe once she felt more secure, she would soften. Maybe she would see that I wasn't trying to compete with her, that all I wanted was to be part of their happiness. But deep down, a quiet ache began to grow. It whispered to me late at night when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Something is changing, and soon you may not recognize the life you once knew. As weeks turned into months, the subtle remarks grew harder to dismiss. It wasn't just the food or the way I decorated the house anymore, it was everything. I remember one evening my son was working late, and she and I were alone in the living room. I tried to strike up a conversation, asking her about her work, her interests, anything that might draw us closer. She answered politely, but with a tone that felt rehearsed, as though she was fulfilling an obligation rather than truly engaging. When I suggested we cook together sometime, her lips curved into a small smile, but her words were sharp. That won't be necessary. I'd rather manage things in my own way. It stung more than I wanted to admit. She could have simply said she was busy. Instead, it felt like a dismissal of everything I had to offer. Another moment still lingers in my mind. My son and I had always had a little tradition. Every Sunday morning, we'd share breakfast together before he went about his day. It was something that started when he was a boy, just the two of us at the kitchen table talking about school, his dreams, or sometimes nothing at all. One Sunday, I prepared his favourite meal and waited. But when he walked into the kitchen, she followed close behind. She glanced at the plates I had set out and said, "Oh, we were planning to eat out today." My son hesitated, his eyes meeting mine for just a second before he nodded in agreement with her. That morning, I sat alone at the table, staring at the uneaten food, wondering when such a simple tradition had become too much to ask. The hardest part wasn't the words she used, it was the way she seemed determined to erase my place in his life piece by piece. Where I once stood as his comfort, his confidant, she now stood between us, closing the distance with every passing day. And he, perhaps out of love or fear of conflict, allowed it to happen. But I didn't want to believe I was losing him. I told myself this was just a phase. Marriage was new and adjustments always take time. I thought if I showed her kindness, if I remained patient, she would eventually see me not as a rival, but as family. Yet the quiet ache inside me grew louder. It whispered through the silence of empty rooms, through the meals I ate alone, through the way my son's eyes avoided mine whenever she made another cutting remark. I tried to silence it, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. My place in the home I had built with love was slowly disappearing. The memory of their wedding often comes back to me now, though not in the way I once hoped. On that day, I stood among the crowd, clutching the bouquet I had been given, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride and fear. My son looked so handsome, standing at the altar with the woman he had chosen. His smile was wide, his eyes full of a future I had always wanted for him. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment I gain a daughter, the moment our family grows. I had spent weeks preparing, ensuring everything looked perfect. I had pressed his suit myself, added the finishing touches to the decorations, even stayed up late helping to finalize details that no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't my day, but it felt like a day I had waited my whole life to witness. When they exchanged vows, my tears were real. I cried because I believed love was something sacred, something that could heal the loneliness I had carried for so many years. I believed this marriage would bring more warmth into our home, not take it away. But as I watched her slip the ring onto his finger, I caught the glance she gave me. Quick, sharp, unmistakable. It was the kind of look that says, "You are no longer needed." I dismissed it at the time, telling myself I was imagining things, that nerves and emotions were clouding my judgment. But looking back now, I know that glance was the beginning of everything. When they walked into the house for the first time as husband and wife, she surveyed the rooms as though she were appraising something she already owned. Her smile was polite but distant, her words laced with a kind of finality I couldn't quite place. That night, as I cleared away the last of the wedding decorations, I felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle in my chest, a heaviness that hasn't left me since. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself that love takes time to grow, that perhaps she simply needed space to feel comfortable. I believed patience and kindness could bridge the gap between us. After all, I wasn't asking for much. All I wanted was to remain a part of my son's life, to share in his joy, to continue being the mother who had stood by him when the world seemed too heavy. But deep down, I knew something was unraveling. It was as if the foundation I had built with my own hands, years of sacrifice, years of love, was slowly being chipped away. And no matter how tightly I held on, it was slipping from me, piece by painful piece. Before I take you deeper into what came next, let me pause here. If you've ever given your all to family, only to feel unappreciated or pushed aside, I ask you to take a moment, subscribe, like this video, and share your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and your support helps me continue sharing stories like this one. The days that followed their wedding brought no peace. At first, I tried to convince myself that the tension I felt would ease with time. But instead, it only grew sharper, like tiny cracks spreading through glass. It began with the little things, comments disguised as casual observations, words that seemed harmless to an outsider, but carried a sting only I could feel. One evening, I prepared dinner just as I had for years. My son had always loved the comfort of my cooking, the roasted chicken, the stew, the bread fresh out of the oven. It was food that carried memories, reminders of his childhood. When I placed the dishes on the table, she gave a tight smile and said, "You always make so much. We really don't eat like this anymore." My son nodded silently beside her. That small gesture, that quiet agreement, cut me deeper than her words. It wasn't just the food, it was the message. The traditions I had worked so hard to maintain suddenly felt unwanted. Another time, I offered advice on paying a household bill, something I had always handled before. She looked at me with raised brows and replied, "We can manage. You don't need to worry about things like that anymore." I should have let it roll off my back, but the tone in her voice was clear. My presence wasn't necessary, and my son who once clung to me for guidance, remained quiet. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. It wasn't always outright rejection. Sometimes it was in the silence that followed my words, the way conversations stopped when I entered the room, the way decisions were made without my input, even though it was my home. Slowly, I began to feel like a visitor living under my own roof. What hurt the most was how invisible I became to him. Before his marriage, he used to come home from work and sit beside me, sharing stories from his day. Sometimes we'd talk late into the night, laughing until tears filled our eyes. But now he barely noticed when I was there. His evenings were reserved for her, their private world sealing me out like a locked door. I tried not to complain. I told myself that every marriage needed space and I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly. Still, when I walked past their closed bedroom door, I felt the weight of the walls that kept me on the outside. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. There he was as a boy, grinning with cake on his face during his 5th birthday. There he was on his graduation day, beaming with pride as I held his hand. Each frame was a story of us, a reminder of everything I had given, and yet, standing there, I couldn't help but feel that those memories were slipping away, replaced by a life where I no longer belonged. I wanted to believe I was overreacting, that things weren't as bad as they seemed. But each small remark, each silence, each dismissal confirmed the truth. I was being pushed out of the very life I had built for him. The shift in the household was not sudden but steady and relentless, like a quiet tide swallowing the shore. What was once our home began to feel like theirs, and I was the one lingering on borrowed ground. It started with the living spaces. The living room, once filled with my own touches, warm throws on the couch, books I loved stacked on the side table, framed photographs from years gone by, was gradually altered. One by one, my things disappeared. A blanket folded away into storage, my books placed in boxes. Even the photographs, those precious snapshots of a life built with love, were replaced with new frames of just the two of them. I asked once, lightly, "Where did the picture of your graduation go?" Her smile was polite, her words smooth. "Oh, I thought it might be nice to freshen things up. Don't worry, I stored it safely." Stored, as though the life we shared belonged in a box, out of sight. In the kitchen too, I began to notice the difference. She reorganized shelves, moved dishes to places I'd never think to look, and when I tried to help, she would often say, "I've got it. You don't need to trouble yourself." On the surface, her words were kind, but the message was clear: step aside. The isolation grew heavier with each passing day. My son, caught in the middle, seemed blind to the way I was being edged out. Or perhaps he chose not to see. He spent most evenings with her, their laughter drifting from their room while I sat in the quiet, the television flickering in front of me, more companion than either of them. I tried to be understanding. Newlyweds need time together, I told myself. But the truth was harder to ignore. I was no longer part of his world. The hardest blow came during a family holiday. For years, I had prepared the meals, decorated the house, and kept traditions alive, even after his father passed. That year I set the table as I always had, hoping we could share at least one moment of togetherness. But before we sat down, she leaned over to my son and whispered something. He nodded, and then he said gently, "Maybe we should start doing things differently now. New traditions, you know." I smiled as best as I could, but inside I broke. New traditions, words that cut deeper than he realized. They weren't just changing a meal, they were erasing the threads of family that had held us together for decades. That night I sat in my room, listening to the faint murmur of their laughter in the next room. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt hollow, like a guest overstaying her welcome. I told myself to hold on, to endure. Surely, if I gave her time, she would open her heart to me. Surely, if I showed nothing but patience and kindness, she would see that I wasn't her enemy. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance grew wider, the silence heavier. And with every change in the house, every decision made without me, I realized something painful. The life I had built around my son was no longer mine. Even with the distance growing between us, I refused to let go of hope. I told myself maybe she just needs time. Maybe if I reach out in the right way, she'll see I only want peace. So I tried. I tried more than I can explain. One afternoon, I invited her into the kitchen. "Would you like to learn how I make his favourite stew?" I asked, smiling, hoping to bridge the gap. Cooking had always been my son's comfort, a piece of his childhood I thought she might appreciate sharing. Her response was simple, clipped. "He doesn't really eat that anymore. I'll cook for him." The words were polite enough, but the sharpness underneath was undeniable. It was as though she was telling me, without needing to say it outright, that my role in his life had expired. Another time, I asked if she'd like to go shopping with me. It wasn't about the shopping itself. It was about creating moments together, the kind of mother-daughter bond I once dreamed of. She smiled faintly, shook her head and said, "I already have plans." No apology, no attempt to reschedule, just a closed door in the form of a simple sentence. Still, I didn't give up. On his birthday, I baked the cake I had made for him every year since he was a child. I decorated it just as I always had, with the little details he loved. When I brought it out, she glanced at it and said, "Oh, I already ordered one from the bakery." I froze in place, holding the cake in my hands, feeling foolish. My son laughed lightly and said, "Well, I guess we have 2 cakes this year." But he cut into hers first. I smiled, but inside, something cracked. It wasn't just about the cake, it was about the years of love, the traditions that once meant everything, being brushed aside like they were nothing at all. The most painful part was not her rejection, it was his silence. He saw the moments. He saw the looks. He saw the way she dismissed me. But he never stepped in, never reminded her that I mattered too. I began to feel like a shadow in my own home. I would cook, clean, and quietly fade into the background, hoping for a small word of thanks, a sign of appreciation. Most nights none came, but the hardest blow came one evening when I joined them in the living room. They were watching a movie together, and I sat at the edge of the couch, trying not to intrude. Halfway through, she turned to him and whispered something. He nodded. Then she turned to me and said gently, "Would you mind giving us some space? We'd like to enjoy this on our own." Her words were soft, but the message landed like a stone in my chest. I nodded, stood, and walked to my room, my heart pounding with humiliation. Behind me, the laughter of the movie carried on, while I sat alone in the dark. That night, I finally admitted something to myself. No matter what I did, no matter how much love I offered, she wasn't going to let me in. And my son wasn't going to stop her. There was one evening that still lingers in my memory like an open wound. It was late and I had prepared dinner. Nothing extravagant, just a meal made with love. I called out to them, letting them know the food was ready. They came to the table, sat down, and for a brief moment, I felt something close to normal. I asked her how her day had been, genuinely trying to open a door. She looked at me for a second, then back at her plate and answered, "Busy." Nothing more. No details, no warmth. I smiled anyway, refusing to let it end there. "Well, you're both working so hard. I just want to make things easier when I can." She put down her fork and said, almost too casually, "You don't need to worry about us. We can manage ourselves." Those words stung. Manage ourselves. As if I had no place anymore, no role in the life I had built with my son from the very beginning. I glanced at him, hoping, just hoping, for some sign, some reminder that he valued me. But he stayed quiet, eating as though nothing had happened. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't just being pushed aside, I was being erased. The small remarks that once seemed trivial were no longer small. They were pieces of a larger truth. I was no longer welcome in my own home. Every effort I made to belong, every attempt to connect, was met with a wall of indifference or quiet dismissal. And slowly, painfully, I began to wonder, was I fighting a battle that was already lost? I would lie awake at night, replaying conversations, asking myself if I had done something wrong. Had I been too protective? Too present? Too much? But no matter how I twisted the memories, the answer was always the same. I had only ever loved him. That was my crime. What hurt the most was that he knew my heart. He knew how much I had given up, how much I had carried, how much I still wanted to give. And yet, he allowed her coldness to harden the walls around us. By the end of those weeks, the house no longer felt like mine. It felt like I was intruding in a space I had once built with my own hands. I tiptoed around corners, avoided the living room, and stayed in my room as if I were a guest. No, less than a guest. Because a guest is welcome. I was not. And in those quiet, suffocating nights, a question began to echo louder and louder. How much longer can I endure this before I lose myself completely? If you were in my place, giving your all but feeling pushed away at every turn, what would you do? Would you stay and keep trying? Or would you step back to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments, because your thoughts truly matter. It began with whispers, little jabs that could almost be brushed aside. But soon the subtle comments gave way to sharp words spoken openly, without hesitation or disguise. One evening, I had prepared a meal. carefully choosing dishes that had always been my son's favourites. I placed the plates on the table, feeling proud, thinking perhaps this could be a moment of warmth for us again. But before a bite was even taken, she looked at the food and said, "You don't need to cook for us anymore. It makes me feel like we can't handle things ourselves." Her tone was smooth, almost polite, but the words carried a dagger hidden behind them. I froze, my hands tightening on the chair. I tried to smile, to keep my composure, but inside, I felt my heart sink. My son shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat, but said nothing. His silence was a louder betrayal than any words could have been. Days later, another remark cut deeper. We were sitting together when she spoke directly, this time with no veil of politeness. "She hovers too much. It feels like I can't breathe in this house. It's as if every little thing I do is being judged." I wasn't even in the room when she said it. I overheard it from the hallway, my son sitting there quietly, offering no defense, no correction. His silence told me he either agreed or simply didn't care enough to stop her. That moment broke something inside me. I walked back to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the walls that had once echoed with laughter, birthdays and celebrations. Now, they held only tension and unspoken words. The next morning, I made coffee and tried again to extend peace. I placed a cup in front of her, offering a small smile. She looked at it, then at me, and said, "You don't have to do these things. Honestly, it feels like you're trying too hard. It's uncomfortable, trying too hard. As if my love for my family was a burden, as if caring was a flaw." I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded softly, and retreated to the corner of the room. But each word stayed lodged inside me, heavy and suffocating. The house became less and less of a home. Meals were quieter, filled with unspoken tension. I could see the way she leaned closer to my son, whispering in his ear, casting glances in my direction as though I were the enemy. And all the while, he remained silent. That silence was worse than the words she spoke, because her words cut me. But his silence, his refusal to stand by me, was what truly made the wounds bleed. As the weeks passed, the silence between my son and me grew into something I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just silence at the dinner table or in the living room. It was a silence that lived inside him, an unwillingness to acknowledge the growing chasm between us. There were moments when I would look at him and search for the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run into my arms after school, who whispered his fears to me when storms rattled the windows, who promised he would always take care of me when I grew old. But those memories felt like echoes from another life. Now, when I tried to speak, his eyes darted away. When I asked questions, his answers were short, as though each word was a burden. And when she made her remarks, he would shift in his chair, press his lips together, and let the words hang in the air like truths carved in stone. One evening, I found myself standing at the doorway of his room, watching him scroll through his phone while she sat beside him. I wanted to ask him, "Why don't you say something? Why don't you defend me? Don't you see how much this hurts?" But the words stayed trapped in my throat. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. His silence was his choice. It was easier for him to remain quiet than to risk conflict. Easier to let me absorb the pain than to stand against the woman he had chosen to share his life with. That realization was a bitter pill to swallow. One night, unable to hold it in any longer, I sat him down. "Do you even see what's happening?" I asked softly, my voice trembling. "Do you realize how she speaks to me? Do you notice how I feel like a stranger in my own home?" He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "She's adjusting. It's not easy for her either. Maybe you're taking things too personally." Too personally. My chest tightened as though the air had been sucked out of the room. After everything I had sacrificed, after all the years I had poured into raising him, this was what I heard in return, that my pain was nothing more than an exaggeration. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to remind him of the woman who had stood by his side through every hardship. But instead, tears burned my eyes, and I turned away before he could see them fall. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing something I never thought I'd admit. I was losing him. Slowly, steadily, the bond I had believed unbreakable was crumbling. Not because of loud arguments or dramatic betrayals, but because of quiet neglect and a silence that screamed louder than any fight could. And in that silence, I began to feel truly alone. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came in the most unexpected way, during what should have been a celebration. My son had invited a few relatives over for dinner. It was the first time in months the house would be filled with laughter again, and I had clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would feel normal. I spent the day preparing food, cleaning, and making sure everything looked welcoming. I told myself this was my chance to feel like part of the family again. When everyone arrived, I greeted them with warmth. I sat at the table, listening to conversations and trying to join in, but I could feel her eyes on me, sharp and unrelenting. At one point, one of the guests complimented the food, asking who had prepared it. Before I could respond, she leaned forward with a tight smile and said, "Oh, I had to redo most of it. You know how she is, always stuck in old ways that no one enjoys anymore." The words hit me like a slap. The room went quiet for a second, then laughter bubbled up, awkward, uneasy, but loud enough to drown out the ache in my chest. I looked at my son, silently begging him to correct her, to tell the truth, that I had spent the day pouring myself into that meal. But he didn't. He simply lowered his gaze and let the moment pass. I forced a smile, blinking back tears, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. But inside, something broke. Later that evening, when the guests had left, I heard her speaking to him in the kitchen. Her voice wasn't hushed this time. She wanted me to hear. "She needs to understand this isn't her house anymore. She's smothering us. Either she learns to step back or I can't stay here." Her words were deliberate. A line had been drawn, and she made sure I knew it. I stood in the hallway, frozen. The house I had built, the life I had poured everything into, was being turned into a battlefield where I no longer had a place. When my son walked past me later that night, he avoided my eyes. He didn't say a word. His silence once again spoke volumes. And that was the moment I realized I had lost the fight. This wasn't about compromise anymore. It wasn't about trying harder, being kinder, or proving my worth. This was about survival, about protecting the fragments of dignity and peace I still had left. The final straw had been laid before me, and I could no longer pretend that staying was an option. That night, I sat alone in my room long after the lights had gone out. The house was quiet, but inside me there was a storm raging, a mix of grief, anger, and exhaustion. I looked around at the familiar walls, the furniture I had chosen, the photos of my son as a child. Each corner of that house carried my fingerprints, my sacrifices, my love. Yet somehow I had become a stranger here. I whispered to myself, how did it come to this? It wasn't a question of not trying. I had tried, again and again. I had swallowed my pride, softened my words, offered help even when it was rejected. But nothing was ever enough. And now my very presence was seen as a burden. The cruel words from earlier replayed in my head. This isn't her house anymore. And in that moment I knew it was true. Not because it hadn't been mine, but because it had been taken from me, piece by piece, until I no longer recognized it. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I faced the hardest truth of all. The son I had raised, the boy who once promised to stand by me, was no longer willing to fight for me. His silence was louder than any betrayal. I realized then that if I stayed, I would lose more than just space at the table. I would lose myself. my dignity, my peace, my sense of worth. Leaving felt like tearing out my own heart. But sometimes, the deepest act of love is letting go, even when it breaks you. The next morning I packed a small bag. Just the essentials: clothes, a few keepsakes, and one framed photo of my son as a little boy, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. As I zipped the bag shut, I whispered, "I love you, but I can't stay here and be erased." I walked out of the house quietly, no goodbyes, no confrontation, just silence. The air outside was heavy, yet it carried a strange freedom. With every step away, I felt both the weight of loss and the faint stirrings of relief. I didn't know where I was heading or what the future held, but I knew this: I deserved peace. And for the first time in a long time, I chose myself. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you deeply loved? Not because you stopped caring, but because staying meant losing yourself? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your strength. The night I decided to leave, I barely slept. My body lay on the bed, but my heart paced restlessly, torn between love and survival. How could I walk away from my son? The very reason I had endured so many storms, the child I had once held in my arms and promised never to abandon. Every fibre of me wanted to cling to him, to keep fighting for the bond I had poured my life into. But what was left of that bond now? Each time she dismissed me, each time he stayed silent, I felt another thread of connection snap. And I knew that if I stayed any longer, the final thread would break and I'd lose myself in the process. I sat up in bed, pressing my hand to my chest as though I could hold the ache in place. "Do I love him enough to leave?" I whispered to the empty room. The question seemed absurd, yet it was the only one that made sense. Love had kept me here, enduring the small humiliations and the greater betrayals. But maybe love also meant knowing when to let go, before bitterness swallowed me whole. The thought of leaving felt unbearable. I had built my entire life around him. Every corner of this home told the story of my sacrifices: the nights I stayed awake nursing him through fevers, the mornings I skipped meals so he could eat first, the years I carried both mother and father roles on my shoulders. And yet, those same walls now suffocated me. I walked through the house slowly, my fingers grazing the surfaces that once felt warm and familiar. The kitchen counter where we had baked cookies together when he was a boy. The hallway where I once taped up his drawings, proud of his creativity. The living room where we celebrated birthdays, laughing so loudly the neighbours would stop by to join in. Each memory whispered, "Stay." But the weight of the present shouted louder, "Go." By dawn, my decision was made. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of survival. If I didn't leave, I would wither inside these walls, reduced to nothing more than a shadow in a house that had once been mine. I pulled out a small suitcase from the closet. My hands trembled as I folded clothes, each motion heavier than it should have been. This wasn't just packing. This was unravelling years of a life, condensing them into a single bag. I paused when I came across a framed photo of my son as a boy, his smile wide, his arms wrapped around me after his first school play. I pressed the photo to my chest, tears soaking the glass. That little boy would never have let me feel unwanted. But the man he had become, he chose silence. With the photo carefully tucked into my bag, I zipped it shut. The sound echoed in the quiet room, final and heavy, like a door closing on the life I once knew. I sat for a moment, breathing deeply, gathering the strength to take the first step. Because once I walked out that door, there was no turning back. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Leaving is not the end. It is the beginning of reclaiming yourself." With the suitcase ready, I stood in the middle of my room, staring at the door. It was strange, how something as simple as walking out of a room could feel like crossing an ocean. I picked up the bag and walked slowly down the hallway. Every step echoed with memories. The first door I passed was his old bedroom. I paused, my hand hovering over the knob. I hadn't stepped inside in years, not since he had grown up and moved into his own space with her. Still, I pushed the door open gently, as if afraid to disturb the past. The room was different now. Emptier. More like a storage space than the place it once was. But in my mind it came alive again. I saw him as a little boy, sprawled on the floor with his toys, looking up at me with that smile that could melt away any fatigue. I heard his laughter, his voice calling, "Mom, come play with me!" For a moment I almost dropped the bag and stayed. Almost. But the memory dissolved, and the reality returned. Dust on the shelves, boxes stacked in corners, and no trace of the boy I once knew. Only the man who had let silence build walls between us. I closed the door softly, as if sealing away both the room and the ache it carried. As I made my way down the hall, I stopped in the living room. My eyes drifted to the couch where we had once cuddled up with blankets, watching movies late into the night. I could almost feel the weight of his head on my shoulder, his small voice asking questions about the characters on screen. I touched the back of the couch, whispering, "I hope you remember those nights." Then my gaze moved to the family photographs still hanging on the walls. They told the story of us: birthdays, school achievements, graduations. I had hung each frame with pride, never imagining I would one day walk past them feeling like an outsider. The hardest moment came when I entered the kitchen. That room had always been the heart of our home. I remembered mornings filled with the smell of pancakes and evenings where we sat at the table sharing stories of our days. But now the kitchen was silent. Cold. I set my hand on the counter and let the memories wash over me one last time. "This was our world once," I whispered, "but it doesn't belong to me anymore." I turned toward the front door, my steps heavier with each movement. When I reached it, I hesitated. My hand rested on the doorknob, and for a moment I thought I heard his voice, my little boy's voice, calling from the past. "Don't go, Mum. Stay with me." My heart clenched. But then I remembered the man he had become, the silence, the indifference, the choice he had made to let her words cut me without lifting a finger. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply and whispered, "I love you too much to let this destroy me." With that, I opened the door. The air outside hit me like a wave, different, unfamiliar, but alive. I stepped across the threshold, pulling the door shut behind me. And just like that, the chapter of my life I had built within those walls ended. But somewhere deep inside I knew another one was waiting to be written. The door clicked shut behind me, and for a moment I just stood there on the front step, my suitcase at my side. The cool air wrapped around me, carrying the sounds of the neighborhood, distant laughter, a dog barking, the hum of cars passing by. It should have felt ordinary. But to me it felt like stepping into a new world. I turned my head and looked back at the house. My house. At least it once had been. Every brick, every window, every corner carried a story of sacrifice. I had worked so hard to keep that roof over our heads, to make sure my son grew up safe and loved. And yet here I was, walking away, not because I wanted to, but because staying meant erasing myself piece by piece. My chest ached as memories surged forward. I remembered the day I first brought him home from the hospital, cradled in my arms, too small for the world, but big enough to fill my entire heart. I remembered his first steps across that very living room floor, his laughter echoing down the hallways, his teenage years filled with both slammed doors and late-night talks. I thought about all the meals I had cooked, the holidays I had prepared, the times I had gone without so he could have more. That house was not just walls and furniture. It was my life, stitched together by moments of love and sacrifice. And now, I was leaving it behind. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to keep walking down the path. With each step, I felt as if I were carrying both the weight of grief and the faint flicker of something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom, not freedom in the sense of joy or relief. No, this was heavier, bittersweet. It was the freedom of choosing dignity over despair, the freedom of reclaiming the pieces of myself that had been trampled on. I whispered into the evening air, "I still love you, my son. I always will. But I can't let your silence destroy me." The words felt like both a goodbye and a promise. As I reached the street, I stopped and turned for one last look. The lights inside the house glowed softly, and I imagined them sitting there together, unaware of how final this moment was for me. I wanted to scream, to beg him to come after me, to say, "Don't leave, Mom. I need you." But no such words came, and so I pulled my suitcase behind me, step after step, until the house disappeared from view. With every block I put between myself and that front door, the ache in my chest deepened, but alongside it grew a quiet strength. Because for the first time in years, I was walking toward myself. I found myself at the bus station that evening, the kind of place where people come and go without much notice. Suitcases rolled across the pavement, announcements echoed over the speakers, and strangers rushed past me with their own destinations, their own burdens. I sank into a bench, my suitcase tucked close, and for the first time since closing that door, I let myself truly cry. Silent tears streamed down my cheeks, not just for the home I had lost, not just for the son who had slipped away from me, but for the life I had built that now felt like it had vanished in an instant. It hurt in a way words could never fully capture. It wasn't just sadness. It was the hollow ache of knowing I had given everything, and somehow, it still hadn't been enough. Yet as I wiped my face with trembling hands, a thought crept in. Maybe this was not an ending. Maybe it was the beginning of something I had long forgotten how to dream about. For so many years I had lived for others, for my husband until the day he was gone, for my son, from the moment he first opened his eyes, for my daughter-in-law, even when she offered me only disdain. My life had been poured out like water, filling everyone else's cup, while mine remained empty. But tonight, sitting in that noisy station, I realized that walking away, though it tore me apart, was also an act of love for myself. It didn't erase the memories. Those would always live inside me. My son's laughter, his first day of school, the holidays we spent together, the way he once hugged me so tightly when he thought I was the only safe place in the world. Those memories belonged to me, and no one could strip them away. But love, as I was learning, sometimes means letting go. Not because I wanted to, but because holding on was killing me inside. I thought about what tomorrow would look like. It was frightening, the idea of starting over so late in life. Where would I go? Who would I be if not the mother at the centre of her son's home? But then another whisper came, a gentler one this time. You are still you. You are more than the roles you've played. And you are still here. I drew in a deep breath, feeling the sting in my chest ease just slightly. For the first time in so long, I considered that my life could belong to me again. I didn't know if my son would ever reach out. I didn't know if he would ever see what his silence had cost me. But I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer define my worth by whether or not he did. As the bus pulled into the station, its headlights cutting through the night, I stood and gripped the handle of my suitcase. My heart was heavy, yes, but within that weight was also a spark of resolve. Walking away had shattered me, but it had also set me free. And in that freedom, I would learn how to live again, not as someone's sacrifice, not as someone's shadow, but as a woman who had given all the love she could and was finally ready to keep some of it for herself. The first nights away from my son's home were the hardest. The silence of my small rented room felt heavier than any argument I had endured under that roof. I would wake in the middle of the night, instinctively listening for footsteps, voices, or the familiar creak of the hallway I once walked 100 times a day. But all I heard was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint noise of traffic outside. At first, that silence felt unbearable. It reminded me of what I had lost. I would sit by the window, holding a cup of tea, and let the tears come freely. The loneliness pressed against me like a weight, making me wonder if I had truly made the right choice. And yet, in that same silence, something else began to stir. For the first time in decades, I was not rushing to cook a meal for someone else, not tidying a space to make it welcoming for others, not arranging my day around another's needs. The hours stretched wide before me, and while they felt empty at first, they also carried a strange sense of possibility. I started small. I unpacked my suitcase slowly, carefully folding each piece of clothing and arranging it into drawers. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I placed a single framed photo of my husband and son on the nightstand. Every time I looked at it, my chest ached, but it also grounded me. It reminded me of where I came from and of the love that had once been the foundation of my life. In the mornings, I began walking to a nearby park. At first, it was just to pass the time, to avoid sitting alone in my room. But soon, I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The sway of the trees, the laughter of children running across the grass, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves. Each step reminded me that the world was still turning, even if mine had been broken apart. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench watching families gather, an elderly woman struck up a conversation with me. She had kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth. We talked about simple things: the weather, the neighbourhood, the flowers blooming nearby. Before I knew it, she was inviting me to join her weekly knitting group at the community centre. I hesitated at first. I hadn't held knitting needles in years, and part of me felt too drained to try. But something inside urged me to accept. And so, the following week, I went. That room was filled with laughter, chatter, and the soft clicking of needles. For the first time in what felt like forever, I found myself smiling. Not because I was trying to hide pain, but because the moment genuinely lifted me. The women welcomed me without questions about my past, without judgment. They saw me simply as I was. Another woman searching for connection. Little by little, life began to feel less empty. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it softened. I started cooking meals just for myself, experimenting with recipes I had always wanted to try, but never had the chance to. I began reading books I had long tucked away. I even started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper, giving myself permission to feel everything I had kept inside for years. I was still healing, still raw with the memory of walking away from my son's home. But with each small step, I realized something important. I hadn't walked away from life itself. I had walked toward a chance to rediscover it. The weeks turned into months, and what once felt like unbearable emptiness began to shift into something softer, almost comforting. I still had nights when I cried myself to sleep, when the memory of my son's silence pressed too hard against my heart. But those nights were no longer every night. The knitting group became more than a hobby. It became a lifeline. Every Thursday afternoon, I would walk into that warm room and find women who greeted me with smiles, saved me a seat, and treated me as if I had always belonged. We shared patterns, stories, and laughter. They teased me when my first scarf turned out uneven, and I laughed with them, realizing I didn't have to be perfect. One of the women, a retired teacher, often sat beside me. She listened more than she spoke, and when I finally shared a small part of my story, the fact that I had raised my son alone, that things hadn't ended the way I imagined, she simply squeezed my hand and said, "You deserve peace." Those words clung to me. No judgment, no probing questions. Just affirmation that my worth wasn't tied to the pain I carried. Outside of the group, I started exploring other parts of the community centre. There were book clubs, gentle exercise classes, even workshops where people painted ceramics or learned to bake. Each activity reminded me that the world still had room for me, that I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I also found unexpected companionship in small, everyday encounters. The woman who owned the corner store began greeting me by name. A young mother at the park once asked if I could watch her toddler for a moment while she tied her shoe, and the child's innocent smile tugged at something deep within me. Even the landlord of my small apartment stopped one evening to chat about the plants on my balcony, offering tips on how to keep them thriving. These moments, though ordinary, stitched themselves together into something extraordinary. Belonging. Slowly, I began to notice changes in myself. My shoulders no longer carried the same heaviness. My laughter returned. Not the polite kind I used to force, but genuine laughter that came from somewhere deep. I even caught myself humming while preparing dinner, realizing I was no longer haunted by the silence of the room. Most importantly, I began to see myself not only as a mother, or a widow, or a woman defined by sacrifice, but as a person in her own right. Someone who still had value, dreams, and a right to joy. One evening, as I sat journaling by the window, I wrote down a thought that surprised me. I am learning to live again, and it is mine to shape. It struck me then that transformation doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, through shared laughter, warm tea, and small acts of kindness from strangers who become friends. And though I still carried the wound of my son's absence, I was no longer defined by it. For the first time in a long while, I was defined by possibility. While my days were filling with new rhythms, elsewhere my son's life was unravelling in ways I hadn't yet seen. I heard about it first from a mutual acquaintance, a woman who had once attended gatherings at our home. She mentioned casually that my son and his wife seemed tense in public, their smiles thinner, their words sharp. I tried not to let the news stir too much inside me. After all, I had promised myself that my peace would no longer depend on his choices. And yet, I couldn't deny the pang of curiosity and sorrow that followed. Not long after, my phone rang one evening. I nearly dropped the receiver when I saw his name flash across the screen. My heart raced, torn between longing and fear. When I answered, his voice was quieter than I remembered, lacking the certainty it once carried. "Mum," he began, pausing as if the word itself was difficult to say. I just wanted to hear your voice." For a moment, I couldn't find my own. Memories surged back. The little boy who used to call me that with such joy. The young man who once promised he'd always take care of me. I swallowed hard and managed a simple, "I'm here." There was silence on the line, heavy with everything unspoken. Finally, he admitted, "Things aren't easy right now. I've been thinking a lot about how I treated you, about what I let happen." His voice cracked. "I should have stood by you." Tears blurred my vision. I had dreamed of hearing those words, yet now that they came, they brought both relief and sorrow. Relief that he saw me at last. Sorrow that it had taken so much distance, so much pain for him to realize. I listened as he spoke haltingly about the cracks in his marriage, his wife's discontent, her sharp remarks that no longer seemed reserved only for me. He confessed he often felt trapped, that the harmony he thought he was choosing when he stayed silent had never truly come. "I miss you," he whispered finally. "I miss the way things used to be." I closed my eyes, clutching the phone tightly. I wanted to rush back into that role, to fold him into the unconditional safety of a mother's love. But I also knew I could not return to the old dynamic, not after what I had endured, not after the strength it had taken to walk away. So I told him gently, "I miss you too, but I need you to understand. I can't go back to how things were. I can't live in a place where my dignity is denied." There was a pause. I braced myself for anger or defensiveness, but instead, he sighed. "I know. I hope it's not too late for us." When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. My emotions swirled: grief, love, hesitation, hope. Part of me longed to believe this was a turning point, that perhaps my son and I could rebuild. Another part feared being hurt again. But one truth rang clear in my heart. I was no longer powerless. This time, I had a choice. And for the first time in years, my son seemed to understand that too. After that first call, my son reached out more often. Sometimes it was a brief message, sometimes a late-night phone call when his thoughts grew too heavy to bear alone. His words carried regret, a searching kind of sorrow, and though I welcomed the sound of his voice, I remained cautious. I had learned too much about silence, about the way love can be twisted when respect is absent. This time, I refused to surrender the ground I had gained. When he asked if he could visit me, I agreed, but with boundaries. "You're welcome to come," I told him, "but this is my home now. You will step into it with respect, or not at all." He hesitated, then promised he would. And when he finally arrived, standing awkwardly in the doorway of my modest apartment, I saw the boy I had raised flicker through the eyes of the man before me. His shoulders slumped, his voice low as he said, "I'm sorry, Mum." It was not a grand apology, not dressed up with excuses or explanations, but it was real. I could see the weight of his choices pressing on him, could hear in his voice that he finally understood the cost of his silence. I welcomed him in, offered him tea, and we sat at my small table. For the first time in years, we spoke as equals, not as a mother desperately clinging to her son, nor as a son caught between loyalties, but as two people trying to find their way back to one another. He asked about my life, about the knitting group, the books I was reading, the plants I had kept alive on the balcony, and I realized then how much I had grown, not just in finding these new joys, but in allowing him to see me as more than the mother who once gave everything. I was a woman with a life of her own, a life that would continue with or without his approval. The more we talked, the more I felt a shift inside me. His remorse was real, but my strength was not dependent on it. I could accept his apology without erasing the past, could open the door to reconciliation without surrendering the dignity I had fought so hard to reclaim. Before he left that evening, he asked quietly, "Do you think we can start over?" I looked at him for a long moment. "We can move forward," I said gently, "but not backward. I can't be who I was in that house. I can only be who I am now." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and for once, I believed he understood. After he was gone, I stood at the window and watched the night settle over the city. My heart was heavy, yes, but also steady. I no longer felt like a woman defined only by loss. I was someone who had walked through heartbreak and emerged with her head high. I knew the road ahead would not be simple. My relationship with my son would take time to mend, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time in a long while, I was at peace with that uncertainty, because I had found myself again. And no matter what happened between us, I would never lose him again. When I look back now, it feels as though I've lived two different lives. The first was defined by sacrifice, pouring every ounce of myself into the people I loved, believing that devotion would always be enough to secure my place in their hearts. The second began the day I walked away from the house I had built, trembling with loss but holding tight to the one thing I could no longer surrender: my dignity. It is strange, isn't it? How love, when left unchecked, can blur into something heavy, even suffocating. For years I believed being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left of me. I thought silence was patience, that endurance was strength. But I have since learned a different truth. Love without boundaries is not love. It is surrender. I do not regret what I gave. My years of sacrifice shaped my son into the man he is today. My sleepless nights, my long days of work, my unwavering support. They were acts of love I would never take back. But I do regret believing that love meant I had no right to expect respect in return. Walking away was the hardest choice of my life. There are still mornings when I wake up aching for what once was, still moments when I see a mother and son laughing together and feel a sharp sting inside me. But there is also peace now. Peace in knowing I chose myself before bitterness could consume me. Peace in knowing I still have worth even outside the role of mother. The truth is, we cannot always control the way others treat us. We cannot force gratitude nor demand loyalty from hearts unwilling to give it. What we can control is the way we honor ourselves. And sometimes, honoring ourselves means letting go of the very people we thought we could never live without. My son and I are finding our way again, slowly, carefully. But I know now that reconciliation cannot mean a return to the woman I once was. It must mean acceptance of the woman I am today, one who values her dignity as much as her love. This is the lesson my journey has carved into me. Sacrifice without boundaries will hollow you out, but love balanced with self-respect will sustain you. And as I sit here sharing my story, I hope it reaches someone who needs to hear it. That choosing peace does not make you weak, and walking away does not mean you have failed. Sometimes it is the bravest, most loving act you can offer yourself. In the quiet of my evenings now, I often sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world move on outside. Children laugh as they race down the street, neighbours exchange greetings, and life continues in its endless rhythm. And I think to myself, though my journey has been marked by loss, it has also been marked by discovery. I discovered that my worth does not depend on the role I play in someone else's life. I discovered that peace is not given. It must be chosen, often at great cost. And I discovered that even when love feels broken, dignity can stitch the pieces of a soul back together. Yes, I still carry the ache of what I left behind. A mother's heart never stops longing for her child, no matter the distance, no matter the silence. But now that longing does not define me, I can hold love for my son in one hand and self-respect in the other, without letting either one slip away. If I could speak to the woman I was on that night I walked out, trembling, heartbroken and uncertain of the future, I would tell her this: you will survive this, and not only survive, you will live. Because the truth is, sometimes walking away is not the end of love, but the beginning of freedom. And now, I leave you with this question. If it were you, would you have stayed and endured, sacrificing your peace for the sake of holding on? Or would you have walked away, as I did, to protect your soul, even if it meant carrying the pain of separation? Think about it and share your heart in the comments below. If you believe every woman deserves peace and respect, I invite you to subscribe, like this video, and share it so that more people can hear stories like mine. Together we can remind each other that dignity is never too much to ask for.